All right, so I got a story here for you guys that I think is just a perfect insight into how completely corrupted and dysfunctional the US healthcare system, and really more specifically the big pharmaceutical industry here in the United States actually is. So about 2 months ago, I told you guys about this new pill that had just come out from the company Merck, and it's basically a COVID pill that was supposed to treat COVID once you get it. And they were telling us, according to the data that they had coming out from Merck themselves at the time, they told us that this was supposedly going to be able to slash the rate of hospitalization in half for people who get COVID and have mild to moderate symptoms. So pretty big advancement, right? If that was actually true. Now, we have some new data that unfortunately undercuts that 50% number, but nonetheless, even if it's somewhat effective to any degree whatsoever, to any percentage, we were basically getting price gouged out the ass for this drug, okay? So here's the kicker. Merck sells federally financed COVID pill to the US for 40 times what it costs to make. Okay, so not only were they selling us this drug, price gouging us in a completely ridiculous and unacceptable way for life-saving medication, but on top of that, the COVID-19 treatment molnupiravir was developed using, surprise, surprise, the National Institutes of Health and Department of Defense funds. Okay, so again, the same pattern that we have been seeing in the vaccines that have been developed, in many of the treatments that have been developed, the same is true for this Merck pill, okay? The US federal government, through our various institutions, whether it's the NIH or the DoD, we give tens of millions of dollars in federal funds for institutions to go and do research and development. They find drugs that are potentially able to, help in this case for the treatment of COVID-19. Then a private company gets the licensing to those drugs and then sells it back to the US government, who had already funded the development of the drug and taken on the large portion of that, risk, as these private companies always like to pretend that they take on. So the federal government takes on the risk, funds the development of this drug. A private company gets the licensing and then price gouges the American government for that same drug. So this is nothing surprising. This is basically, again, what's been happening over the entire course of the pandemic. But what really makes this even more egregious is not only the amount, because it costs $17.74 to produce and $712 is what we're paying for it. Okay, so it's just a completely ridiculous, inexplicable gap that really only exists because the US federal government is completely cucked to the pharmaceutical industry, and all of our lawmakers think that this type of thing is acceptable because, believe it or not, they are taking bribes from these big pharma lobbyists. So again, nothing too surprising if you understand the nature of the US government and how completely bought and controlled by corporate America all of these motherfuckers actually are. But on top of that, we now have data that is actually undercutting the initial efficacy that they had promised when they sold the drug to the United States for billions and billions of dollars. Again, price gouging us. So not only are we getting price gouged, but on top of that, potentially the efficacy is much lower than what they had promised initially. So the FDA apparently officially approved this drug, by the way, but it was very divided and controversial. So a panel of experts advising the FDA voted narrowly in favor of emergency use authorization of an antiviral pill from Merck and Ridgeback Biotherapeutics to treat COVID-19, and the vote was 13-10. And the FDA isn't obligated to follow the recommendations of its advisors, but typically does. So 13-10 vote, very close margin here. So they say the Merck drug is taken twice a day for 5 days and works by causing a cascade of disabling mutations in the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus during replication. And the drug is intended for use by people with mild to moderate illness and who are at risk of developing severe COVID-19. And it is supposed to be taken within 5 days of symptoms. So that's just the basic rundown, right? Nothing too complicated. But here's the new data, okay? So an interim analysis of a clinical study of the drug found that molnupiravir, which is this pill, cut the risk of hospitalization or death in half. So that's the original study that I was talking about that came out of Merck. But they say among people who got the drug, 7.1% ended up in the hospital or died, compared to 14% who got the placebo. However, the final study analysis released Friday shows only a 30% reduction in the risk of hospitalization or death. So is 30% 0%? No. So this pill could still have some efficacy, and I'm not trying to imply that like anti-vaxxers do, as if like the vaccines don't work or as if this doesn't work. It's still saying it has a 30% efficacy rate. So that is, has the potential to save a bunch of lives, right? So I'm not trying to say that it's completely ineffective, but that's half. Okay, that's half of what was initially promised in the 50% number that we basically used in justifying spending billions and billions of dollars on being price gouged for this drug in the first place. So we're being price gouged for a drug that we were basically misled into believing it was much more effective. But they continue here saying that an FDA summary, and this is absolutely wild, but an FDA summary showed that in the second half of the study, patients in the group treated with the drug were more likely to be hospitalized or die than those who got the placebo, and the drug's protection against death seen in the first half of the study didn't hold up in the second half. What? I mean, listen, I'm not, a scientist or anything, but that seems kind of weird that you would have such dramatically different results in the first half of a study versus the second half of a study. But they continue here saying that when asked about this discrepancy by committee chairperson Dr. Lindsay Baden, Dr. Nicholas Kartsonis, a Merck senior vice president, said, "I don't have a satisfying answer to your question." I don't have a satisfying... How are we supposed to trust this then? If the senior vice president for this company can't explain why there was such a wide discrepancy between the first half and the second half of this study, that just seems weird to me. That seems very weird, and that's probably the weirdness that caused, a 13-10 vote to be the end result of this, right? It wasn't like it was unanimous. It's not like they unanimously approved this thing. It was pretty much split evenly, all right? So kind of alarming in a way, but again, if it's 30% effective, then it's 30% effective, and those are lives that could potentially be saved by this drug. But again, in a broader picture, the main point that I'm trying to get you guys to understand is this is why people don't trust the medical establishment. This is why people don't trust Big Pharma. And if you follow my channel, you'll know I'm pro-vaccine. I'm very pro-vaccine. I don't even marginally do any anti-vax content at all. Why? Because I look at the data, I look at the science, and I trust a lot of these scientists. And so I understand that the data is very clear on the vaccines. The vaccines are effective at largely preventing hospitalization and death, okay? I'm vaccinated, my entire family is vaccinated. But this is why you kind of understand a little bit why so many people in this country don't trust Big Pharma. Granted, they are, being skeptical of Big Pharma in the wrong ways because the vaccines are effective. That's not the conspiracy. The actual conspiracy surrounding the vaccines is that they are withholding access to the vaccines to inflate their profit margins. That's the actual conspiracy surrounding the COVID vaccines. But this, again, whether it's treatments or whether it's vaccines, we've been price gouged on all of them across the board. And it's not even just in drugs related to COVID, okay? One of the most popular provisions that was just taken out of Biden's social spending plan, the Build Back Better Act, was having Medicare negotiate drug prices for the American people. Think about this for a second. The US federal government is not legally allowed at the moment, because of the laws that our politicians have put in place, the federal government is not legally allowed to negotiate drug prices with private for-profit companies. What? Of course we're going to get price gouged. Of course they're going to arbitrarily, as Merck just did with this pill, jack up the price times 40, okay? And that's exactly what they did. Because if you give them leeway to price gouge you, they will. That's the nature of capitalism. That is the nature of a for-profit privatized healthcare system, okay? So this doesn't make sense from any fucking angle. Not only is it politically unpopular to allow the American people to be price gouged, okay? And this is coming from, the same people who would defend this type of price gouging. They say, oh, it's innovation and we have to protect our innovation within the healthcare industry. Well, I just told you guys that this pill, along with basically all of the COVID treatments so far and the vaccines, were largely developed with public funding. So these big pharma executives or any of these big healthcare executives, they do not innovate, okay? You know who innovates? Scientists. And you know who else can fund scientists and does fund scientists to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars? The US federal government. So the situation, as capitalists describe it, is completely wrong. It's not that these big pharma executives or the big pharma corporations themselves are big innovators. It's that they are buying innovations. They are taking innovations that were largely developed with public funding, okay, and then buying those innovations, restricting access to those innovations to profit off of them and to price gouge the American people along the way because they have completely bought and control basically the entirety of both the Republican and Democratic parties. So that is why this shit is allowed to happen. That is why this shit is seen as normal, is because all of these people have been completely bribed. All right. So again, the conspiracy, the point is not that all of these drugs are ineffective. The point is, to the degree that they are effective, why are we being price gouged for drugs that we helped develop in the first place? It doesn't make sense. Again, doesn't make sense from a political angle because upwards of 90% of the American people want our government to negotiate drug prices so that we are not being price gouged. Okay. It doesn't make sense from a public health standpoint because just as the monoclonal antibodies are available to somebody like Joe Rogan, who has the money and access to get those treatments, those are not available to everybody. And I'm assuming that this pill, with the amount that we have been price gouged, it's roughly like $500 to $700 for a course of treatment. People can't even afford in this country a surprise $400 payment. All right. So you're making it less accessible. So it doesn't make sense from a political angle, doesn't make sense from a public health angle. It doesn't make sense from even an economic angle because again, these are the same motherfuckers who pretend to care about fiscal responsibility. These are the same people who tell us that we can't afford free public college. Just as one example that was taken out of the Build Back Better Act. Again, free public college costs roughly $10 billion a year. Not even talking about how much we spend on the military and all of this other ridiculous shit. You just spent $2 billion this year on one a couple million doses of this fucking COVID pill right here that is only 30% effective, and you got price gouged out the ass for it. So they're willing to shovel out billions and billions of dollars between both the Pfizer pill that has come out and the Merck pill that has come out. Our federal government would have ended up spending the same amount that it would have cost to get free community college. And again, the only reason why they're putting those billions there instead of in free community college is because these for-profit, privatized big pharma companies are allowed to price gouge the government and thereby price gouge the American people. So it doesn't make sense from any angle. This is why people don't trust big pharma, okay? People's hearts are in the right place. Their minds are a little bit in the wrong place in terms of what they think they should be skeptical about. You shouldn't necessarily be skeptical about the science behind the vaccines or behind these pills. You should be skeptical, but you should believe the final results. But at the end of the day, that's not the conspiracy. The conspiracy is capitalism. The conspiracy is wide out in the open. The conspiracy is our politicians taking bribes from big pharma, as Kirsten Sinema did, and then opposing Medicare negotiating drug prices. That's the conspiracy. The conspiracy is open. It's out in the open. It's the profit motive.